Margaret Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The grand estate stretched before her, perfectly manicured lawns leading to ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of her family's secrets. At 42, she had lived her entire life within these walls, following the rules and expectations that came with being born into one of the country's most prominent families. The morning routine never changed. Margaret would wake at 6, dress in clothes chosen by her personal assistant, and join her husband Charles for breakfast in the formal dining room. They would discuss the day's schedule, charity events, and business matters with the polite distance that had defined their 20-year marriage. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, wealthy, influential, and devoted to public service. But Margaret harbored a secret that would destroy everything if discovered. Her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. A simple message appeared. "Good morning, beautiful. Can't wait to see you today." Margaret's heart raced as she quickly deleted the text. She glanced toward the bathroom where she could hear Charles preparing for his day, the sound of running water and electric razor creating a familiar soundtrack to her deception. The sender of the message was David Chen, a talented architect who had been hired 6 months ago to oversee the renovation of the estate's east wing. What had started as professional meetings about floor plans and historical preservation had slowly evolved into something neither of them had planned. Margaret found herself looking forward to their discussions about restoring the original woodwork, not because she cared about preservation, but because she was falling in love with the passionate way David spoke about bringing old buildings back to life. Their first real conversation had happened during a rainstorm. Margaret had found David in the library, studying old blueprints of the house by lamplight. The power had gone out, and instead of leaving, he had stayed to continue his work by candlelight. Margaret had brought him coffee, and they had talked for hours about the house's history, about dreams and disappointments, about the difference between existing and truly living. "I never realized how lonely I was until I met you," Margaret had confessed that night, the words slipping out before she could stop them. David had looked at her with such understanding that she felt seen for the first time in years. "Loneliness in a crowded room is the worst kind," he had replied softly. That conversation had changed everything. What followed were stolen moments throughout the weeks that followed. They would meet in different parts of the vast estate, always with the excuse of discussing renovation plans. The conservatory became their favorite spot, hidden among the exotic plants that Margaret's grandmother had collected from around the world. Margaret knew the risks. The Whitmore family had been in the public eye for decades. Charles was being considered for an important government position, and any scandal could ruin not just their marriage, but his entire political career. Her family's charitable foundation, worth millions of dollars, could suffer irreparable damage. The media would have a feeding frenzy if they discovered that the perfect society wife was having an affair with the hired help, as they would surely describe David. But when she was with David, none of that mattered. He saw past the designer clothes and carefully styled hair to the woman underneath, who had given up her dreams of becoming a teacher to marry the man her parents had chosen. David listened when she talked about the book she wanted to write, the places she wanted to travel, the simple life she sometimes imagined living in a cottage by the sea. "You're still young enough to change your life," David had told her just last week as they walked through the rose garden. "It's never too late to choose happiness over duty." The sound of Charles clearing his throat from the doorway brought Margaret back to the present. She turned to find her husband adjusting his tie, his face wearing the same politely distant expression it had worn for years. "The security company is coming today to upgrade the surveillance system," Charles announced, checking his watch. "Something about new cameras and monitoring equipment. I trust you'll handle the details while I'm at the office." Margaret's blood turned cold. New security cameras meant new ways to be watched, new risks of discovery. Is that really necessary? "The current system seems perfectly adequate." Charles frowned slightly. "Margaret, we've discussed this. With my potential appointment to the cabinet, we need to take security more seriously. The team will be installing cameras in all common areas and upgrading the monitoring station in the basement. It's for our protection." After Charles left for his morning meetings, Margaret immediately texted David, "We need to be extra careful today. New security system being installed." His response came quickly, "Don't worry. We'll figure this out together." Meet me in the conservatory at noon? Margaret spent the morning watching technicians install small, nearly invisible cameras throughout the house. They worked efficiently, explaining that the new system would be monitored 24 hours a day from a central location downtown, with recordings stored digitally for 30 days. The lead technician showed her how the system would send automatic alerts for any unusual activity. What kind of unusual activity? Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Movement in areas that should be empty, people in restricted zones, that sort of thing. The artificial intelligence can even recognize faces and track individual movements throughout the property. Very sophisticated stuff. As noon approached, Margaret's anxiety grew. Every step toward the conservatory felt like walking toward her own destruction. But when she saw David waiting among the orchids, his face lighting up at the sight of her, she knew she couldn't stop. Whatever the consequences, what they had was worth the risk. "We can't keep meeting like this," she said as he pulled her into his arms. "Then let's stop meeting in secret," David replied, his voice serious. "Leave with me, Margaret. Tonight. We can start over somewhere no one knows us." Margaret looked into his eyes, seeing the future he offered, uncertain but filled with love. Behind them, a tiny camera lens reflected the afternoon light, silently recording everything. Margaret stared at David in shock, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. Leave tonight? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. She had dreamed of escaping her gilded cage, but the reality of actually doing it felt overwhelming. "David, I can't just disappear. There are responsibilities, obligation," she began, but he gently placed his finger on her lips. "There's always going to be another obligation, another reason to stay trapped in a life that makes you miserable," he said softly. "When does Margaret get to choose what Margaret wants?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps on gravel made them both freeze. Through the glass walls of the conservatory, they could see James, the head groundskeeper, approaching with a clipboard. Margaret quickly stepped away from David, pretending to examine a particularly exotic flowering vine. "Mrs. Whitmore, sorry to disturb you," James called out as he entered. "The new security team wants to install a camera in here as well. Something about covering all glass structures on the property." Margaret's stomach dropped. The conservatory had been their safe haven, the one place where they felt truly alone. "Is that really necessary?" "This is just a greenhouse, and I'm afraid so, ma'am. They say the glass makes it a potential security risk. Someone could break in here and access the main house. They'll be by within the hour to set it up." After James left, Margaret and David stood in stunned silence. Their sanctuary was about to become another watched space, another place where they couldn't be themselves. "This decides it then," David said firmly. "We can't wait any longer. Tonight, after the household is asleep, I'll pick you up by the old carriage house. We can be 3 hours away before anyone notices you're gone." Margaret's mind raced through the complications. "Charles will call the police. They'll say you kidnapped me. Your career will be ruined." "I don't care about my career if it means losing you," David replied, taking her hands. "And once we're settled somewhere new, you can contact them yourself. Explain that you left willingly. It'll be a scandal, but scandals fade. Regret lasts forever." That afternoon, Margaret went through the motions of her normal routine while her thoughts churned. During her scheduled visit to the family's charitable foundation office, she found herself staring at the portraits of previous generations of Whitmore women, all of whom had married well and lived quiet, proper lives. Had any of them ever felt the suffocating weight of expectations? Had any of them ever wanted to run away? Her assistant Patricia noticed her distraction. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you feeling all right? You seem a bit off today." "Just tired," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. "The security installation at the house has been disruptive." Patricia nodded sympathetically. "I imagine it would be. All those strangers in your private space. Speaking of which, the security company called. They want to schedule a final walkthrough with you this evening to explain all the new features." Margaret's carefully laid plans began to crumble. A meeting with the security team would run late into the evening, making it impossible to slip away unnoticed. She needed to find an excuse to cancel or postpone. "Actually, I'm not feeling well. Can we reschedule for tomorrow?" "Of course. I'll call them right away." But when Patricia made the call, she returned with disappointing news. "They say tonight is the only option this week. They need to complete the system activation and train you on the monitoring protocols. It's apparently required by Mr. Whitmore's insurance company for the new policy." Margaret realized that Charles had planned this more carefully than she initially thought. The new security system wasn't just about his political career. It was about controlling her movements. Had he somehow discovered her relationship with David? The timing seemed too coincidental. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Change of plans. Meet me at the old oak tree at midnight instead. The one where you said you used to hide as a child. The old oak tree was at the very edge of the property, far from the house and hopefully beyond the reach of the new cameras. Margaret had spent countless hours there as a lonely child, reading books and dreaming of adventure. It felt fitting that it might be the launching point for the greatest adventure of her life. That evening, the security team arrived promptly at 7. The lead technician, a professional woman named Susan, spent 2 hours showing Margaret every aspect of the new system. The technology was more advanced than Margaret had imagined. Motion sensors, heat detection, facial recognition, and even audio recording in certain areas. The system is designed to learn your family's normal patterns, Susan explained as they stood in the central monitoring room in the basement. After a few weeks, it will automatically flag anything unusual. For instance, if someone who doesn't live here is detected in the house repeatedly, or if there's movement in restricted areas during odd hours. Margaret's mouth went dry. The system would definitely detect David's presence if he had been visiting during the day. How far back can it track these patterns? The learning period starts fresh with the new installation, but we did integrate data from your previous system. The AI has already identified some interesting patterns from the past few months. On the monitor, Margaret watched in horror as Susan pulled up a compilation video showing David's movements throughout the house over the past weeks. The old system had been recording more than she realized. There he was entering the conservatory, leaving the library, walking through the garden with someone just out of frame, someone who was clearly Margaret. We noticed this individual appears frequently in the recordings, Susan continued, pointing to David's image. The system has flagged him as a person of interest. Is he a regular employee or family friend? Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. He's the architect overseeing our renovation. Those meetings were all work-related. Susan nodded, but her expression suggested she found something odd about the pattern. Of course. The system just notes the frequency and duration of visits. Some of these meetings lasted several hours, often in locations away from the actual renovation work. After the security team finally left at nearly 10 o'clock, Margaret sat in her bedroom, staring at the small camera now mounted discreetly in the corner. Every movement she made was being recorded and analyzed. The new system would make escape nearly impossible, but staying was no longer an option either. At 11:45 p.m., Margaret made her decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, wrote a letter explaining her choice, and quietly slipped out of the house through the kitchen door she knew had a blind spot in the camera coverage. The night air was cool against her face as she made her way across the moonlit grounds toward the old oak tree. David was already waiting, his car parked on the narrow lane that bordered the property. But as Margaret approached, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Small red lights blinking in the darkness around the tree's massive trunk. The security company had installed cameras even here, in the most remote corner of the estate. Their escape was being recorded in real time. Margaret froze at the edge of the tree line, her escape bag clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The red blinking lights of the security cameras seemed to mock her desperation. David stepped out of the shadows, and she could see the same realization dawning on his face as he spotted the surveillance equipment. "They're watching everything," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the night breeze rustling through the oak leaves. David moved closer, careful to stay in the shadows between the cameras. "We can still do this. Once we're off the property, they can't track us. My car is just beyond that stone wall." But Margaret knew it was too late. Even now, somewhere in a monitoring station downtown, security guards were probably watching their every move. The advanced system would have already flagged their unusual nighttime activity and alerted the authorities. Within minutes, there would be police cars blocking every exit from the estate. "I can't," Margaret said, the words tearing at her heart. "If we run now, you'll be arrested for kidnapping. They'll destroy you, David. Your career, your reputation, everything." "I told you I don't care about any of that," David replied urgently. "Margaret, this is our only chance. Tomorrow they'll find some excuse to fire me and ban me from the property. Charles isn't stupid. He knows exactly what's been happening between us." The distant sound of car engines approaching confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Headlights swept across the grounds as multiple vehicles raced up the main drive toward the house. The monitoring company had indeed called in the alert. "Go," Margaret said firmly, pushing David toward the stone wall. "Please, just go. If they find you here with me, it will be so much worse." "I'm not leaving you," David protested. But Margaret was already stepping into full view of the cameras, making it clear that she was alone and returning to the house voluntarily. "If you love me, you'll go," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Find another job, another life. Forget about me." David stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with anguish. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared over the stone wall just as the first security vehicle rounded the bend in the lane. Margaret walked slowly back toward the house, each step feeling like a nail in the coffin of her dreams. The floodlights came on as she approached, bathing the entire area in harsh white light. Charles stood waiting on the front steps, still in his pajamas but fully alert. "Going somewhere, darling?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "I needed some air," Margaret replied, knowing how pathetic the lie sounded. Charles gestured to the bag in her hand. "With luggage? How thoughtful of you to pack for a midnight stroll." The security guards from the monitoring company arrived within minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers. Charles played the role of the concerned husband perfectly, explaining to everyone that his wife had been under tremendous stress lately and might not be thinking clearly. "She's been acting strangely for months," he told the officers, while Margaret stood there like a child being discussed by adults. "I've been worried about her mental state. Perhaps she needs professional help." The implication was clear. Margaret was having some sort of breakdown, and any claim she might make about having an affair or wanting to leave her marriage could be dismissed as the fantasies of an unstable woman. One of the police officers, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, approached Margaret gently. "Mrs. Whitmore, is there anything you'd like to tell us? Are you in any danger? Do you need our help?" Margaret looked into the officer's compassionate eyes and almost broke down. She wanted to scream the truth, to explain about David, about the suffocating prison her life had become, about the desperate need to feel alive again, but she knew that any emotional outburst would only support Charles's narrative about her mental instability. "I'm fine," Margaret said quietly. "I apologize for the disruption. I haven't been sleeping well and I thought a walk might help. I didn't realize how far I had wandered." The officer didn't look convinced, but without any evidence of actual danger or criminal activity, there was nothing more she could do. After taking down the basic details of the incident, the police left with warnings about the dangers of wandering alone at night. Charles waited until they were completely alone before dropping his mask of concern. "Where is he?" he asked coldly. "Who?" Margaret replied, though they both knew exactly who he meant. "Don't insult my intelligence, Margaret. The security company provided me with very interesting footage from the past several weeks. Your architect friend has been spending a lot of time in areas that have nothing to do with renovation work." Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped that David had gotten away clean, but if Charles had weeks of surveillance footage, there would be clear evidence of their relationship. "David Chen," Charles continued, consulting his phone. 34 years old, graduated from State University, works for Heartfelt Design Associates. Lives alone in a small apartment downtown. No family money, no political connections, no social standing whatsoever. "I have to admit, Margaret, I'm disappointed in your choice of rebellion. If you were going to have an affair, you could have at least chosen someone from our social circle." The casual cruelty in his voice made Margaret's stomach turn. "It's not what you think." "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think," Charles replied. "But here's what's going to happen. Mr. Chen's contract with us will be terminated immediately. The renovation project will be completed by another firm. You will undergo counseling for your obvious emotional problems, and we will present a united front to the public. My political career will not be derailed by your midlife crisis." Margaret stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their 20-year marriage. He wasn't angry about her betrayal or heartbroken by her desire to leave. He was simply annoyed by the inconvenience to his plans. "What if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Charles smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I'll make sure Mr. Chen never works as an architect again." A few calls to the right people, some suggestions about professional misconduct, perhaps even criminal charges for trespassing or theft. His career will be over and he'll spend years trying to clear his name. The threat hung in the air between them, Margaret understood the choice she was being given. Submit to Charles's control completely or watch the man she loved be destroyed. And if I agree to your terms, then Mr. Chen disappears quietly from our lives. He finds work in another city, hopefully another state. No harm comes to him professionally. You get the help you clearly need and we continue our marriage as if none of this ever happened. Margaret nodded slowly, feeling the last of her hope drain away. I understand. Good. Your first counseling appointment is tomorrow at 10. Dr. Sarah Mitchell comes highly recommended for dealing with women in your situation. She specializes in helping wives adjust to the realities of their positions in society. As Margaret climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, defeated, hollow-eyed, trapped. The cameras followed her movement, recording every step of her surrender. In her bedroom, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and opened the letter she had written earlier, the one explaining her choice to leave. Slowly, carefully, she tore it into tiny pieces and dropped them in the wastebasket. Then she lay down on her bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling until dawn broke through the windows. Somewhere across town, David was probably packing his own belongings, preparing to leave the city and the woman he loved behind forever. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office was everything Margaret had expected. Soft beige walls, comfortable leather chairs, and the kind of generic artwork that was meant to be calming, but instead felt coldly impersonal. Margaret sat rigidly in the chair across from the doctor, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the interrogation to begin. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband is very concerned about you, Dr. Mitchell began, her voice professionally warm but with an underlying edge that suggested she had already formed her opinions. He's told me about your recent episode and your struggles with depression and anxiety. Margaret almost laughed at the clinical language being used to describe her desperate attempt at freedom. Is that what we're calling it? Dr. Mitchell made a note in her file. How would you describe what happened 2 nights ago? For a moment, Margaret considered telling the truth. She imagined describing David, their conversations in the conservatory, the way he made her feel alive for the first time in decades. She thought about explaining the suffocating nature of her marriage, the way Charles treated her more like a useful accessory than a partner. But then she remembered Charles's threats against David, and she chose her words carefully. I've been feeling trapped lately, overwhelmed by expectations and responsibilities. I thought getting some air might help clear my head. And the suitcase you were carrying? Margaret had rehearsed this answer. I wasn't thinking clearly. I suppose I had some fantasy about taking a vacation, getting away from everything for a while. But of course that's impossible with Charles's career and our commitments. Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. It's very common for women in your position to feel overwhelmed by the demands of supporting a husband's political ambitions. The constant public scrutiny, the social obligations, the need to always present a perfect image, yet it can be quite stressful. Over the next hour, Dr. Mitchell skillfully guided the conversation toward a predetermined conclusion. Margaret's feelings of entrapment were reframed as symptoms of depression. Her desire for independence became evidence of an inability to appreciate her privileged position. Her longing for authentic connection was dismissed as unrealistic expectations about marriage. Marriage is a partnership, Mrs. Whitmore, but it's also a business arrangement, especially at your social level. Love is wonderful, but mature women understand that stability, security, and mutual respect are more important than romantic fantasies. Margaret left the appointment with a prescription for antidepressants and instructions to return twice weekly for the foreseeable future. The message was clear. She would be medicated and monitored until she accepted her role as Charles's supportive wife. Meanwhile, David's life was being systematically dismantled. Margaret learned from Patricia, who had heard it from the staff, that his contract had been terminated for unprofessional conduct. The official story was that he had been stealing materials from the renovation project, though no formal charges were filed. Within days, word spread through the architectural community that David Chen was unreliable and potentially dishonest. Margaret tried calling him once, but his phone had been disconnected. She drove past his apartment building and found it empty, with a "for rent" sign in the window. Charles had been thorough in his revenge, ensuring that David disappeared completely from their world. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of antidepressants and therapy sessions. Margaret attended charity luncheons and political fundraisers, smiling and playing her part while feeling increasingly disconnected from her own life. The cameras continued to watch her every move, and she began to feel like she was living in a prison where the bars were made of expectation rather than steel. But something unexpected happened during her 4th week of treatment. Patricia approached her after a foundation meeting with an unusual request. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's about the renovation project. Her name is Linda Chen." Margaret's heart stopped. Chen, David's last name. She followed Patricia to the small waiting area, where a woman in her 70s sat clutching a worn handbag. The resemblance to David was unmistakable in her kind eyes and gentle smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Linda Chen, David's mother," the woman said, standing slowly. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I need to ask you something." Margaret glanced around nervously, aware that this conversation would likely be reported back to Charles. "I'm not sure what you want from me, Mrs. Chen." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "My son is missing. He left town 3 weeks ago after losing his job here, and I haven't heard from him since. The last thing he told me was that he had fallen in love with someone he could never be with, someone whose husband had threatened to destroy him if he didn't disappear." Margaret's carefully constructed composure began to crack. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." "Please," Linda whispered, reaching out to touch Margaret's arm. "I'm not asking you to do anything that would put you in danger. I just need to know if my son is alive. If he's safe. A mother has a right to know that much." The raw pain in Linda's voice broke through Margaret's defenses. This woman was suffering because of choices Margaret had made, consequences she hadn't fully considered when she began her affair with David. "I'm sure he's fine," Margaret said softly, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. "David is a strong, capable man. He'll find a way to rebuild his life." Linda studied Margaret's face intently. "He spoke about you, you know. Never said your name, but I could tell. He said you were the most intelligent, compassionate woman he had ever met. He said you were trapped in a life that was slowly killing your spirit." Margaret felt tears threatening and fought to maintain control. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Chen, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. Your son worked on our renovation project, but we had no personal relationship." Linda nodded sadly, understanding the position Margaret was in. "Of course. I'm sorry to have bothered you." She turned to leave, then paused. "But if you ever do hear anything about David, would you consider letting me know? A mother never stops worrying." She pressed a small piece of paper into Margaret's hand before walking away. Margaret waited until she was alone to look at it. A phone number written in shaky handwriting, with the words, "Please help me find my son," written below it. That evening, Margaret sat in her bedroom staring at Linda's phone number. The antidepressants had dulled many of her emotions, but the image of David's mother, desperate and alone, cut through the chemical haze. She thought about her own mother, who had died 5 years earlier, and how devastated she would have been if Margaret had simply vanished one day. The security camera in the corner of her room blinked steadily, recording her every movement. Margaret looked directly into the lens, feeling a spark of the old defiance that Dr. Mitchell had been trying so hard to extinguish. She might not be able to escape her gilded cage, but she could do one thing to fight back against Charles's complete control. She could help a mother find her son. Margaret picked up her phone and began typing a carefully worded text message to a private investigator she had found online. If Charles wanted to play games with people's lives, she could learn to play them too. Marcus Webb was not the kind of private investigator Margaret had expected to meet. Instead of the rough, intimidating figure she had imagined, he was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who looked more like a college professor than a detective. They met at a small coffee shop downtown, far from Margaret's usual haunts, where she hoped to avoid recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate you reaching out, but I need to be completely honest with you," Marcus said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Taking on a case that involves a prominent family like yours could be complicated. There are risks for both of us." Margaret had prepared for this conversation carefully. "I understand your concerns, but this isn't about me or my family. It's about a missing person whose mother is desperate for answers." David Chen worked briefly on our estate renovation before leaving town suddenly. His mother hasn't heard from him in weeks. Marcus pulled out a small notebook and pen. "You mentioned on the phone that there might have been some kind of conflict that led to his disappearance. Can you elaborate on that?" Margaret chose her words carefully, aware that everything she said could potentially be used against her later. There were some disagreements about the project. Mr. Chen's contract was terminated and he left shortly afterward. I believe he may have felt his reputation in the local architecture community was damaged. And you have no personal connection to Mr. Chen beyond the professional relationship? Margaret met his eyes steadily. None whatsoever. I'm simply a concerned person who met a worried mother and wants to help. Marcus studied her face for a long moment before nodding. I'll need some basic information to start the search. Full name, last known address, vehicle information if you have it, names of friends or colleagues he might contact. Margaret provided what little information she had, then watched as Marcus outlined his plan. He would start by tracing David's movements from the day he left town, checking credit card records, phone logs, and employment inquiries with other architectural firms. It was routine work that would take several weeks to complete. There's one more thing, Margaret said as they prepared to leave. My husband cannot know about this investigation. If he discovers what I'm doing, there could be serious consequences for everyone involved. Marcus nodded gravely. Client confidentiality is absolute in my business, Mrs. Whitmore. But I should warn you, if this investigation uncovers anything that suggests criminal activity, I may be legally obligated to report it to the authorities. After leaving the coffee shop, Margaret drove home with a mixture of hope and terror. She had crossed a line by hiring the investigator, moving from passive victim to active participant in her own rebellion. The antidepressants made it difficult to feel the full weight of what she had done. But somewhere beneath the chemical fog, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. The next few weeks passed in a strange routine. Margaret continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Mitchell, attended social functions with Charles, and managed her responsibilities with the family foundation. But underneath the surface compliance, she was secretly following Marcus Webb's progress through carefully encrypted emails and brief phone calls made from public places. The first breakthrough came after 10 days. Marcus had traced David to Chicago, where he had briefly stayed at a downtown hotel before moving on. Credit card records showed he had purchased gas and food along a route heading west, possibly toward Colorado or California. He's alive and moving under his own power, Marcus reported during a quick phone call. Whatever happened here, he doesn't appear to be hiding from law enforcement. This looks more like someone starting over in a new place. Margaret felt a flood of relief that temporarily broke through her medication-induced numbness. David was alive and free, even if he was lost to her forever. That knowledge made her own situation more bearable, but her secret investigation was about to collide with Charles's carefully constructed control in ways she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Mitchell had been reporting regularly to Charles about Margaret's progress, and she was becoming concerned about what she saw as a lack of improvement. Despite weeks of therapy and medication, Margaret still showed signs of what the doctor called unrealistic expectations about personal autonomy. Your wife seems to be going through the motions of recovery without genuine acceptance of her situation, Dr. Mitchell told Charles during one of their private consultations. She's compliant with treatment, but I sense an underlying resistance to the therapeutic process. Charles had been having similar concerns. Margaret was behaving appropriately in public, but he noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more alert lately, more present, as if she was deliberately focusing on something that wasn't apparent to observers. His suspicions were confirmed when Patricia mentioned an unusual detail about Margaret's recent schedule. Mrs. Whitmore has been making several stops at coffee shops and bookstores lately, Patricia reported during their weekly update. She says she's trying to develop new interests as part of her therapy, but some of the locations seem odd choices for someone of her social position. Charles decided to have Margaret followed discreetly, using the same security company that had installed their new surveillance system. Within days, he had photographs of Margaret meeting with Marcus Webb and detailed reports of their conversations, captured by sophisticated listening devices. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening after Margaret had returned from what she thought was a successful clandestine meeting with Marcus. He had reported that David had been located in Denver, working under an assumed name for a small firm that specialized in sustainable architecture. He was safe, healthy, and slowly rebuilding his career. Margaret had asked Marcus to pass along her contact information to Linda Chen, so the worried mother could arrange her own communication with her son. It felt like a small victory, a way to repair some of the damage that her choices had caused. But as Margaret entered the house that evening, she found Charles waiting in his study with a manila folder spread across his desk. "Please sit down, Margaret. We need to discuss your recent activities." Margaret's heart sank as she saw the photographs of herself with Marcus Webb scattered across the desk. There were images from the coffee shop, from their meeting in the bookstore, even from her brief conversation with Linda Chen weeks earlier. "I'm disappointed," Charles said calmly. "I had hoped the therapy would help you understand the importance of honesty in our relationship. Instead, I discover you've been conducting a secret investigation behind my back." Margaret realized that any attempt at denial would be pointless. "I was trying to help a mother find her missing son." "There's nothing wrong with that. There's everything wrong with it when that son was your lover and his disappearance was the result of your affair," Charles replied coldly. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That you could hire investigators and meet with his family without my knowledge?" Charles opened the folder and pulled out a thick report. "Mr. Webb has been very thorough in his investigation. In fact, his final report makes for fascinating reading. David Chen didn't just disappear, Margaret. He was systematically blacklisted from every major architectural firm in the region, through a series of carefully placed phone calls questioning his professional ethics. His credit rating was mysteriously damaged, making it impossible for him to rent decent housing. He was essentially forced to flee the city and start over with nothing." Margaret stared at her husband in horror. She had known Charles was ruthless, but the extent of his vindictiveness was shocking. "You destroyed an innocent man's life," she whispered. "I protected my family's reputation and my political career from the consequences of your selfish choices," Charles corrected. "And now you've compounded the problem by involving private investigators and drawing more attention to a situation that should have been buried permanently." Charles stood up and walked around the desk to stand over Margaret's chair. "Here's what's going to happen. You will terminate your relationship with Mr. Webb immediately. You will have no further contact with the Chen family, and you will undergo a more intensive treatment program, including medication adjustments that Dr. Mitchell feels are necessary to address your continuing delusions." Margaret looked up at her husband and saw not anger or hurt, but cold calculation. She was nothing more to him than a problem to be managed, a potential threat to be neutralized. "What if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Charles smiled, and the expression chilled her to the bone. "Then I'll have you committed for psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Mitchell has already prepared the necessary documentation, citing your history of erratic behavior, your failed suicide attempt 3 weeks ago, and your current obsession with a man who used and manipulated you." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "I never attempted suicide, and David never manipulated me. That's not what the security footage shows, my dear." A woman in obvious emotional distress wandering alone at night with a packed suitcase, clearly intending to harm herself before being rescued by concerned security personnel. Dr. Mitchell agrees that such behavior, combined with your continued delusions about this David person, suggests a serious break from reality. Margaret understood the trap that had been constructed around her. Every choice she had made, every action she had taken, had been reframed to support a narrative of mental instability. If she continued to resist, she would simply be labeled as further evidence of her own incompetence. But as she sat there, feeling the walls closing in around her, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of surrendering completely, she decided to go deeper underground. Margaret's compliance over the following days was so complete that even Dr. Mitchell commented on the dramatic improvement in her attitude. She agreed to increased medication dosages, attended therapy sessions without resistance, and seemed genuinely grateful for Charles's patience and understanding. To all observers, Margaret Whitmore was finally accepting her proper role as a supportive political wife. But beneath the surface, Margaret was planning something far more sophisticated than her first, impulsive escape attempt. The key to her new strategy came from an unexpected source: her weekly volunteer work at the Literacy Center, one of the few activities Charles still allowed her to maintain for appearances. While helping adults learn to read, Margaret met Elena Rodriguez, a social worker who specialized in domestic abuse cases. During a casual conversation about the challenges facing their students, Elena mentioned how difficult it was for wealthy women to escape controlling relationships. People assume that money equals freedom, but sometimes the gilded cage is the hardest to escape, Elena had said. When someone controls your finances, your social connections, and your reputation, leaving becomes almost impossible without careful planning. Margaret filed away that conversation, and over the next few weeks she began to pay closer attention to Elena's work. She learned about networks that helped women disappear safely, about legal protections for abuse victims, and about the resources available for starting over with new identities. The crucial moment came when Elena mentioned a case she was working on involving a prominent businessman's wife. "We finally got her out last week after months of preparation," Elena said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. New identity documents, safe house in another state, job placement assistance. It takes time and money, but it can be done even in the most controlling situations. Margaret made a decision that required all the courage she had left. "Elena, I need to tell you something in confidence. I think I might need that kind of help myself." Elena's expression grew serious immediately. "Margaret, are you in danger? Is someone threatening you?" Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing that one wrong step could result in her being committed to a psychiatric facility. "Not physically, but I'm being held against my will through threats and manipulation. My husband has made it impossible for me to leave, and he's threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent if I continue to resist his control." Over the next hour, Margaret quietly explained her situation, leaving out the details about David but focusing on Charles's systematic control over her life. Elena listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her professional experience with similar cases. "What you're describing is called coercive control," Elena said finally. "It's a recognized form of domestic abuse even when there's no physical violence. The isolation, the monitoring, the threats to your reputation and financial security, these are all classic tactics." Elena agreed to help, but she warned Margaret that escaping Charles's surveillance would be extremely difficult. "We'll need months to set this up properly. New documents, a secure financial account he can't access, a safe place for you to go where his investigators can't find you. And we'll need to do it all while maintaining the appearance that you're complying with his demands." Margaret's first task was to establish a secret line of communication. Elena taught her to use encrypted messaging apps on a phone she purchased with cash and kept hidden at the literacy center. Slowly, carefully, they began to build an escape plan. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that she was using Charles's own tactics against him. Just as he had systematically destroyed David's life through careful manipulation behind the scenes, she would systematically prepare her own disappearance while maintaining the facade of a compliant wife. Dr. Mitchell, meanwhile, was pleased with Margaret's apparent progress. The increased medication seemed to have eliminated her delusional thinking about leaving her marriage, and she was participating more actively in therapy discussions about accepting her role and responsibilities. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding marriage as a partnership," Margaret told the doctor during one session. "I realize I had unrealistic expectations about romance and personal fulfillment. Charles provides security and stability, and I should be grateful for that." Dr. Mitchell made approving notes in her file. "That's a very mature perspective, Margaret. Many women struggle with similar issues when they reach middle age. The key is focusing on the positive aspects of your situation rather than dwelling on impossible fantasies." Charles was equally satisfied with the apparent improvement in his wife's attitude. Margaret had stopped asking questions about David, no longer showed any signs of wanting to leave the house unaccompanied, and seemed genuinely interested in his upcoming political appointments. But what Charles didn't know was that Margaret was using her newfound access to his study to photograph important documents, bank account information, political correspondence, business contracts, and personal files that could prove valuable if she needed leverage later. The process was painstakingly slow. Elena had explained that women in Margaret's position often took a year or more to escape safely. They needed to move carefully, avoiding any actions that might trigger increased surveillance or suspicion. Margaret's second breakthrough came when she discovered Charles's personal safe while he was away on a 3-day business trip. Years of watching him open it had allowed her to memorize the combination, and inside she found not just important documents, but also evidence of his true character. There were files on several other women, wives of political colleagues, who had caused problems for their husbands' careers. Charles had apparently made a business of helping other powerful men control their wives through intimidation, blackmail, and systematic isolation. Margaret wasn't his first victim. She was just the most recent. Among the files was a detailed psychological profile of Margaret herself, prepared by Dr. Mitchell, outlining her weaknesses and recommending specific manipulation tactics. The doctor who was supposed to be helping her recover was actually helping Charles maintain control over her. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled David Chen Final Resolution. Inside were documents showing that Charles's campaign against David had extended far beyond professional sabotage. Private investigators had been hired to monitor David's activities in Denver, and there were plans to escalate the harassment if he ever attempted to contact Margaret. Margaret photographed everything with the hidden phone Elena had given her, building a comprehensive file of evidence that could protect both herself and David if necessary. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret's escape plan began to take final shape. Elena had arranged for new identity documents through a network that specialized in helping abuse victims disappear. A safe house had been established in Oregon, far from Charles's sphere of influence. Most importantly, Margaret had managed to secretly transfer enough money from her personal accounts to support herself for several years. The date was set for April 15th, during a weekend when Charles would be attending a political conference in Washington. Margaret would simply vanish during one of her supervised visits to the Literacy Center, leaving behind a carefully crafted letter that would make it impossible for Charles to report her as a missing person without damaging his own reputation. But as the escape date approached, Margaret received devastating news that changed everything. Marcus Webb, the private investigator she had hired to find David, was found dead in his office, apparently the victim of a random robbery gone wrong. His files had been destroyed and his computer hard drive had been wiped clean. Elena's expression was grim when she delivered the news. "Margaret, I don't think this was random. Someone wanted to eliminate any evidence of your investigation into David Chen's disappearance." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her once again. If Charles was willing to resort to violence to protect his secrets, her own life might be in danger. The careful escape plan they had spent months developing suddenly seemed inadequate against an enemy who was prepared to kill to maintain control. "We need to accelerate everything," Elena said urgently. "If they killed Webb to cover their tracks, you could be next. We're moving the timeline up to this weekend, ready or not." As Margaret prepared for what might be her last chance at freedom, she couldn't shake the feeling that Charles was several steps ahead of her once again. The man who had systematically destroyed David's life and possibly murdered a private investigator would not simply allow his wife to walk away unharmed, but this time, Margaret had advantages she hadn't possessed during her first escape attempt. She had allies, resources, and most importantly, she had evidence that could destroy Charles's career and possibly send him to prison. The final confrontation was coming, and Margaret was as ready as she could be. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather, and Margaret went through her usual routine with careful precision. Charles had left for Washington the previous evening, confident that his surveillance system and Dr. Mitchell's medication regime had finally broken his wife's spirit. He had no idea that Margaret had been slowly reducing her antidepressant dosage for weeks, regaining clarity while maintaining the appearance of compliance. At exactly 10 a.m., Margaret left for the Literacy Center, just as she had every Saturday for the past 6 months. Patricia waved goodbye from the kitchen window, and the security system dutifully recorded Margaret's departure in the family's sedan. But instead of driving directly to the center, Margaret took a circuitous route through the city, checking her mirrors constantly for signs of surveillance. Elena had taught her basic counter-surveillance techniques, and Margaret was reasonably confident she wasn't being followed by the time she reached their predetermined meeting point, a busy shopping mall across town. Elena was waiting in the parking garage with a different car and a large shopping bag containing Margaret's new identity documents. "Sarah Morrison," Elena said, handing over a driver's license with Margaret's photo but a different name. "Divorced, no children, originally from Ohio. Your backstory is simple and unremarkable, exactly what you want when you're trying to disappear." Margaret stared at the ID card, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Once she walked away from her old life, There would be no going back. Charles's power and resources would be focused on finding her, and if she was caught, the consequences would be severe. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked gently. "Once we leave here, you'll be completely cut off from everything familiar. No contact with friends, family, or anyone from your old life. It's going to be incredibly difficult." Margaret thought about the files she had discovered in Charles's safe, the evidence of his systematic abuse of other women, and the suspicious death of Marcus Webb. "I'm sure, but there's something I need to do first." Instead of heading directly to Oregon as planned, Margaret asked Elena to drive her to the offices of the city's largest newspaper. Along the way, she used Elena's secure phone to upload all the photographs she had taken from Charles's files to a cloud storage account, accessible only to her new identity. At the newspaper office, Margaret requested to speak with Janet Morrison, an investigative reporter known for exposing political corruption. When Morrison agreed to see her, Margaret identified herself and handed over a USB drive containing copies of all the evidence she had gathered. "Mrs. Whitmore, these are very serious allegations," Morrison said after reviewing some of the documents. "Your husband's files suggest a pattern of domestic abuse, intimidation, and possibly criminal conspiracy. But you realize that once I start investigating this story, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Your private life will become very public." Margaret had thought about this moment for weeks. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." Charles' power depends on maintaining his public image. If that's destroyed, he loses his ability to hurt me or anyone else. Morrison agreed to begin investigating immediately, with the understanding that Margaret would be unreachable for comment. The story would run based on the documentary evidence alone, which was substantial enough to trigger criminal investigations and destroy Charles's political career. By the time Margaret and Elena reached the Oregon safe house that evening, the first online edition of the story was already causing a sensation in political circles. Cabinet nominee's secret files expose a domestic abuse network was trending on social media, and Charles's phone was undoubtedly ringing constantly with calls from reporters and political colleagues. The safe house was a modest apartment in a small coastal town, furnished simply but comfortably. Margaret's new neighbor was introduced only as Kate, another woman who had escaped an abusive marriage several years earlier, and now helped others in similar situations. "The first few months are the hardest," Kate explained over dinner. "You'll second-guess every decision, wonder if you made the right choice, miss aspects of your old life that you never expected to miss. But it gets easier. Eventually you remember who you were before you lost yourself in someone else's definition of who you should be." That first night in her new life, Margaret sat by the window overlooking the Pacific Ocean and tried to process everything that had happened. Her phone, her old phone, had been destroyed according to Elena's instructions, cutting her last connection to her previous world. She had no idea how Charles was reacting to the newspaper story, whether he was looking for her, or what consequences his exposed secrets might bring. But for the first time in 20 years, Margaret felt genuinely free. 2 weeks later, Kate brought newspaper clippings and internet printouts updating Margaret on the fallout from the story. Charles had been forced to withdraw his name from consideration for the cabinet position. The FBI had opened an investigation into his business dealings and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Marcus Webb's death. Dr. Mitchell had lost her medical license pending an ethics investigation. Most satisfying of all, several other women had come forward with similar stories of abuse and intimidation, suggesting that Charles would face criminal charges. "There's more," Kate said, handing Margaret a final document. "This came through Elena's network. Apparently someone wanted you to know." It was a brief letter written on simple stationery. "Dear Sarah, I hope you don't mind me using your new name, but Elena thought it was safer. I want you to know that I'm proud of what you did. It took incredible courage to expose the truth and help other women who were trapped like you were. I'm doing well in my new life and have been following the news reports. Justice is finally being served. I hope someday we can meet again when it's safe, but if not, please know that our time together gave me the strength to rebuild my life. You saved me in more ways than you'll ever know. With love and gratitude, D." Margaret held the letter against her chest and cried for the first time since her escape. David was safe. Charles's reign of terror was ending, and she had found a way to transform her personal tragedy into protection for other women who might face similar threats. 6 months later, Margaret, now permanently Sarah Morrison, had settled into a quiet life working at a local library and volunteering with a women's shelter. She had lost her wealth, her social status, and her family connections, but she had gained something far more valuable: the right to make her own choices about her life. Charles was eventually convicted on multiple charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder in the death of Marcus Webb. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and his assets were frozen pending civil lawsuits from his victims. Dr. Mitchell fled the country before she could be arrested, but several other medical professionals were disciplined for participating in Charles's network of abuse and manipulation. Margaret never returned to her old life, but she did maintain contact with Elena, who kept her updated on the ongoing legal proceedings and the network of support services that had grown out of the scandal. The publicity around her case had led to new legislation protecting domestic abuse victims and increased funding for escape assistance programs. On quiet evenings, Margaret would walk along the beach near her new home and think about the chain of events that had led her to this place. Her relationship with David had been brief, but it had awakened something in her that couldn't be suppressed. The understanding that she deserved to be loved and valued for who she truly was, not for how well she played a role assigned by others. She had paid a high price for that understanding, but as she watched the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Margaret knew she would make the same choices again. Sometimes the courage to change your life comes from love, and sometimes it comes from realizing that the life you're living isn't really living at all. The security cameras that had once watched her every move were thousands of miles away now, recording the empty rooms of a house that had been more prison than home. Margaret was finally free to write her own story, and she intended to make it a good one.